Before I introduce John to you, I should mention that the Brekkys are all recorded, which means that you can watch again. It also means that your friends and family can all benefit as well from this morning, and also you can go online on the church's YouTube channel on the playlist for Blokes Brekkys, and you can listen to all the previous fantastic talks that we've had. So I think all I need to do now is to introduce John Graveling here, but I'm not going to introduce John because what he'll be sharing with us is actually going to be introducing himself and telling you all about his time in Cromer. John, you grew up in a house with a lot of history and still live in the grounds of the same house. Can you tell us a bit about that? John.
Okay, well, before I do so, just to, Richard has put this up because a lot of people are not familiar with it, but it's the old Cromer High Station, which does figure once or twice in what I'm going to say anyway. The old Cromer High Station, and you can see the turntable. It was quite a big station and closed with the acknowledgement of Dr. Beeching in the late 50s. So anyway, that explains why that is up there. But also just to put the history correct, Richard said 80 years in Cromer. Well, that's not quite, you might think, well, 80 years in Cromer must be terribly boring. Well, it would be, I guess. But in fact, I haven't been 80 years in Cromer because having left school, I then went and spent 3 years in Birmingham trying to become a civil engineer. And the first job I got, believe it or not, I was asked to go up to report to RF Hemswell in Lincolnshire, and was put on a site there. And I spent 6 months working 7 days a week. Well, we had a couple of weekends off, but doing something when we were never told what we were doing. That's actually true. For 6 months I was working on this and really working hard, and never knew what we were building anyway. But it was at the time of the Cold War. Towards the end of that time, there was this great big long lorry came with about 100-foot long cigar-shaped thing on the back, which was going to go. There were 3 modules there. They were all pointing just north of east, if that makes sense, and you can think about that. And so there was room for these 3 long cigar-shaped modules, which fortunately never got used. So they are 6 months, 7 days a week, and never got used. What about that? But then, and then went from there to worked in Chesterfield, or well, near Chesterfield, because Taylor Woodrow used to like to send their engineers on these big open cast coal sites where they were, had this enormous machinery with drag lines with a bucket which you could put a bus into. And then from there I spent a couple of years in London working in Victoria Street, on a building site, the biggest excavation at the time in London. I could tell you quite a lot about that, but that would take up that whole of the next hour. And then I then spent a year abroad in Holland, in the Netherlands, and then went down to Devon for 5 years, trying to be King Canute and keeping the floodwaters out of people's houses. And then came back and worked for the county council and moved to a little village called Chedgrave down 10 miles east of Norwich. So in fact, 17 years more or less, I haven't been in Cromer, if that's just to put the record straight. I forgot what your question was now, Richard. Growing up at the Grove, I was born in 1936, and my parents, my father was an engine driver, and he loved doing a bit of playing around, trying a bit of farming, and the Grove stood empty, it was put up for auction amongst the whole of the area all around in 1935, and it stood empty, and they were quite ambitious, I suppose, or quite foolish, I'm not sure which, but they rented it in 1936. They probably wouldn't have done if they'd known there was going to be a war 2 or 3 years later, and also if they'd known my mother was pregnant with me. But they went there anyway, and so that's where I was brought up. And I can't remember the first incident, but I had three older sisters. The two older ones the oldest ones were about 10 or 11 years old, and I think I must have been a very noisy baby because my mother asked them to take me out in the pram, which they did, and they got as far as the top of the gangway, and they couldn't hold on to the pram, so apparently I went boom, 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 all the way down the gangway. I'm not quite sure what happened at the end. I have read a little book actually that has some ideas, but I think the ideas may be a little bit tongue-in-cheek. So growing up at the Grove, I grew up, of course, during the war years. For a young lad growing up, and that was exciting during the war years, because there were thousands of soldiers all around Cromer. They used to have those parades, and you could march behind them. Yeah, and of course there were always planes flying overhead. There were, in the evenings you hear the Americans and the British bombers going out that way, and then the German bombers, the sirens would go and they'd come this way, and the man would go around and put out that light. You've got to do black. You always put blackouts all over the windows, and it's very difficult. You always have to do all that, and then of course, then a little while later, about an hour or so later, the sirens go off again as the Luftwaffe would come back to flying back home again, and then of course the British and American bombers would come back. I don't know how they didn't hit each other on the because they must have crossed on the way. Anyway, that was growing up, but the army. There was no end of soldiers around it. They had their ammunition dumps. There was one particular one up the Warren, because a lot of the houses weren't built up the Warren then, which we boys got to know quite well. And if you didn't have any fireworks, there was an abundant supply of thunder flashes in there. Now, if anyone's been in the army, a thunder flash is a very, very loud banger. And if you hold it, you strike it, and if you hold it, it'll blow your hand off. But they make incredible good bangers, these thunder flashes, but I'm afraid that as boys we knew how to get in there and borrow some of those. They didn't get returned. But there was also ammunition dumps up above, well, what was the Links Hotel, and just below there, we knew our way into there as well. And there was a great big gun on the cliffs, just the end of the Warren there. There's this huge naval gun apparently put there, which is about a 10-inch barrel on it. And the only problem with a naval gun, you couldn't fire it downwards, and of course the cliffs were 120 feet above the sea. I don't think it ever got fired. If it had done, the cliffs would probably have gone down. But there was a tunnel going from one of the houses up to this gun, and as boys we knew the way through that tunnel. They were terribly lax in those days, but so we knew where that tunnel was. Just one other thing about the war years, of course. To stop Hitler invading this country, they decided to blow up the central span of the pier. Now, you probably know about this, do you? But anyway, everyone was told to close the windows because they were going to blow it up at 12 midday. And 12 midday came and nothing happened, and 1 o'clock and 2 o'clock, and 3. It was a cold day, 3 o'clock, so everyone started closing the windows. At 4 o'clock, there was an enormous explosion. And the central span of the pier was blown up. I was told this by a man called Richard Barclay, who was living in the town. And there was even bits of steel went right over the church into Church Street, believe it or not. What had happened was they had actually detonated it at 12 o'clock, but it was such a small charge it hadn't done anything. So they then brought in this huge charge and blew up the central pier. And they replaced it with a footbridge, and as boys we used to go on this footbridge. You could bounce it up, and that's great fun bouncing this footbridge up and down as you walked along the pier. At least anyway, doing that it stopped Hitler invading this country, which is a great thing. Now, talking about that, Mrs. Barclay, the vicar of Cromer was Reverend Barclay, and Mrs. Barclay, I might stay in the wrong place. And Reverend Barclay, he was, I don't really know because I wasn't terribly interested, but he was in Cromer from about 36 to 47, 8, I don't know. And his wife, now I'll just tell you a bit about Mrs. Barclay, because who knows what's happening in cricket this summer? Who's playing who?
Australia.
Pardon?
England playing Australia.
It's the Ashes, isn't it? England are playing Australia. And you know how the Ashes were formed? In 1888, England were playing Australia at the Oval, and W.G. Grace was captain, and one of their best players was a man called C.T. Studd. And England were winning that easily. I think they wanted 88 runs to win off the last innings, and they were going to get it easily, they thought. But they kept losing wickets, and Studd should have gone in about number 5, and Grace said, oh, you can win number 8. And so that's what happened. But they kept losing wickets, Studd went in, and he was knocked out at the end, and England lost that test match, and the result, they burnt the bales, which formed the Ashes. Why am I telling you this? Because the wife of Reverend Berkeley was one of Studd's daughters. C.T. Studd, one of his daughters, was the wife of Reverend Berkeley. And it's quite interesting history about C.T. Studd. But Mrs. Berkeley, there was a plane, a German plane crashed at Weybourne, and they brought the young pilot into Cromer Hospital, and somebody said, oh, would she go and see him? She was a bit reluctant because she'd already had 2 sons, both had been killed in the RAF, one was in the RAF and the other in the army. They'd both been killed in North Africa. So she was a bit reluctant. Anyway, she went to see this pilot, and somebody said, well, how did you get on? She said, he was the most charming man you could ever meet, and he spoke perfect English. And I said to him, where did you learn such good English? He said, well, I was sent across to Norfolk in the 1930s so I could spy it all out. What about that, eh? And that was about 5, 6, 7 years before the war. And so that's a bit about Mrs. Berkeley, whose father was C.T. Studd. So that's a little bit about growing up in the Grove, because it was quite a place to be, especially during the war years, and it was, as I say, so exciting. And you saw, Lancasters and Hurricanes and Spitfires and a few Messerschmitts coming over the top. So it was all quite exciting. I better go on to the next bit. What was your next question?
You've mentioned several influential people so far. I understand that this area of Norfolk has a long history of Christians making a big difference in society. Can you tell us more about that?
Okay. Yeah, it is quite interesting because the Grove, it was built by a man called Joseph Gurney. He had 11 children and he needed a rest, so he came to the Grove and he built it there. And Joseph Gurney had these 11 children, but their cousin was a lady called Elizabeth Gurney. Now, Elizabeth Gurney lived at Northropes, and you probably don't know Elizabeth Gurney, but Elizabeth Gurney, she liked chocolate, so she got married into Fry's Chocolate and became Elizabeth Fry. And so that was, her cousins lived at the Grove, and almost certainly, we can't prove it, but almost certainly she'd have come to see her cousins there. And so Elizabeth Fry, and anyone is interested, if you go up into the woods, if you go up Old Strand Road and turn left at a path which goes onto the cliffs, there's what they call the Elizabeth Fry Walk. And there is a monument to Elizabeth Fry in the woods there. It's about 6 or 7 meters diameter, I guess. It's worth going to see because that is where Elizabeth Fry used to stand and preach. And of course, a lot of the woods weren't there, they've grown up since. But Elizabeth Fry, she was a remarkable lady, a remarkable Christian lady. Her faith meant so much to her. She was a Quaker. Quakerism has changed over the years, and she was a bit of a rebellious Quaker, I believe. But she was in London and she went to Newgate Prison. And she said to the warders there, I want to go into this prison and teach all the women there how to I'm going to read the Bible to them and teach them to knit and sew. And they said, you can't, they'll kill you. She said, oh no, they won't. And so she did. And as a result of this, Elizabeth Fry was so disgusted with the prison conditions that she just completely reformed the whole of the prison system in this country. And 2 years ago, I was up in York, and there's a lovely little prison there, which is hardly lovely, but it just says this is one which Elizabeth Fry completely remodeled. So an amazing Christian lady. But not only did that, she went down to the docks in London, where they were exporting convicts to Australia, if that's the right word, and she saw the condition of these ships. She went to Parliament. She said, "This is not good enough. You must do something about it. You've got to improve it." That's the sort of woman Elizabeth Fry was. Her life wasn't always easy, but she was a remarkable lady, and because her connections with the Grove, it means a lot. But a great friend of hers was a man called Thomas Fowell Buxton. Now, if I ask you a question, who was responsible for the abolition of slavery? Any question? Any answers? Yeah, well, he wasn't. Everyone thinks Wilberforce was responsible for the abolition of slavery. He did a lot for it. But what he spent 20 years pushing through Parliament, the abolition of the slave trade. A tremendous achievement, and a wonderful Christian man Wilberforce was. But he passed the baton on to a man called Thomas Fowell Buxton. Now, Thomas Fowell Buxton actually lived in Cromer Hall for one time, and then he moved to Northrop's. If you go to Overstrand Church, on the right-hand side, you'll see 3 plaques on the wall to Thomas Fowell Buxton, because he had the same name as his father and also his son. But Thomas Fowell Buxton became an MP, and he spent another 20 years pushing through Parliament the abolition of slavery in the colonies. And a remarkable man. I've got a really good book, Thomas Fowell Buxton and the Liberation of Slaves. And he spent a lot of time, and that was his great achievement in life, to abolish the slavery in the colonies. Thomas Fowell Buxton. And interesting, Richard Harbord, who lives out at Gunson, I said, well, I haven't seen him for a long while, I suppose if he's still alive. He's written his book, Edward, the Third Lord Suffield. Now, he was a remarkable man. He's not from Cromer particularly, but I mentioned it because he had a lot of Cromer connections. And he also encouraged Thomas Fowell Buxton for the abolition of slavery. And he was quite a remarkable man. And he was also in Parliament and did incredible things actually as well. He was very much a radical peer. And not only that, he went down to Bacton. There's a ship which was wrecked off Bacton, and he spent the night down there rescuing men from this ship. And as a result of this, he was very instrumental in actually forming the National Lifeboat Institution. And he was one of the founders of that, Edward Lord Suffield. And not only that, see, I mentioned cricket. He had, believe it or not, in 1837, well, first of all, Gunton Hall, they had a cricket ground there until it was ploughed up in whatever it was in 1940 sometime. But Edward, the third Lord Suffield, he was so keen on cricket that he actually, in 1837, he actually formed Norfolk County Cricket Club. What about that, eh? Because I had a bit of interest in cricket, and I know there's one or two other people interested in cricket, and he was the one who had a lot to do with the foundation, the formation of the Norfolk County Cricket Club. What about that? But he didn't live in Cromer. And then the other person I'd like to mention is George Berkeley, Battle of Britain pilot. George Berkeley, this was written by his younger brother, Richard. Now, George Berkeley, it's well worth reading that if you can get hold of a copy. It wasn't printed that long ago. It's an amazing story of some of his exploits as a fighter pilot, and the way he crashed 2 or 3 times. He went, well, I won't tell you how much about it, but George Berkeley, eventually he was sent out to North Africa. He should have had a flight of modern Spitfires, but he was actually given some clapped out old Hurricanes, I think, and he was out in North Africa. Sadly, he was shot down there by a German pilot ace, and he was killed. But a wonderful Christian man as well. If you read the book, you'll see how how he meant so much to his squadron, because he was a wonderful Christian man as well. And he was the son of Reverend Berkeley of Cromer, and of course the grandson of C.T. Studd. So there are a few people, living Christians in Cromer.
Your father was an engine driver, but ended up being a town councillor for much of his life, as well as buying what is now Grove Hotel and Restaurant. He must have been a very busy man. How many hours in a day were there back then?
Yeah, well of course, I'll show you that, because he was based most of the time at, well, not most of his life, he was on the London trains at various times. He came to Cromer in 1930s and based at Cromer High Station. And of course, Cromer High Station was a busy station. Some of the London trains even started from Cromer High. They didn't bother to come to Norwich. They went straight, went on the curve there straight to Liverpool Street. And anyway, he was based there. And then a little, on the right-hand side, a little brown shed there. That's where there were about 30 drivers and firemen based on Cromer High Station. And I used to catch the train there to go to school, which was okay, except that you had to go up Mill Road, and the last 100 yards you had to climb a flight of steps. And usually I had that much in time. You were running up those steps to get across and to catch the train at 5 to 9 to go to North Walsham. But my father was an engine driver, and of course I used to, coming back from North Walsham, I'd quite often catch the early train, the Plummer's Milk it was called, and I could go on the footplate with him, which I don't think would be allowed nowadays, would it, Ivan? But anyway, I used to quite often go on the footplate, which was a tremendous experience, much to the envy of other boys. But he was an engine driver for all his working life, which was, and it meant that, you know, but he also, as Richard said, he was a person who just worked so hard. From dawn till dusk, he was working, hedge clipping, milking cows. We had cows, pigs, chickens, and he had all these things run. Being an engine driver was not all honey. Once or twice he came back and he was quite down because, sadly, once or twice people had jumped off bridges in front of the train, which obviously was very sad. But there was one occasion when he said he was just going into Norwich Station, and of course the train was slowing down. He saw this lady standing on the platform, and he thought, she's got to jump. So he slammed the brakes on, and the train came to a shuddering halt. She did jump, and it stopped about 2 feet short of this lady. And he jumped on, he's a big strong man, and he picked her up by the shoulders, put her on the platform, and he really dressed her down apparently. He said, "You silly woman, what do you think you do? You how selfish you are. You could have killed yourself. What about all your family? What were all they going to think?" He really told her off and gave her a rose. We shouldn't do that really, but he did. And anyway, the station people took her away. But of course, people getting off the train, they came off. "What sort of driver do you think you are, coming into the station like that?" Because they'd all been, because people always like to get up early on the train and they start to open the doors before they're ready. And of course, they all got shunted all over the place, and they just couldn't appreciate what had happened. The sequence of this was that 2 or 3 days later, the station master at Norwich received a letter, and and this letter said from this lady's family, saying how much they thanked the driver for stopping that engine just in time. And so there was a good sequel to that. But as I say, he was an engine driver, and of course a lot of the people at the station all had nicknames. There was one who was called Mutton. I can't remember what his proper name was, but he came down to the Grove one day, and my father said to my mother, "Oh, Mutton's coming for tea today." So he came in and she said, "Oh, hello, Mr. Mutton." And I was sitting down and my father was kicking up, man, his name is not Mutton. Anyway, I couldn't understand that, but she kept calling him Mr. Mutton. But anyway, he came down. There were lots of interesting characters came up who worked on the station, and that was another one. And we had cows, and I'll tell you a bit, we had lots of animals. We weren't particularly well geared up for them, but there was one occasion when I think my father must have been working. I obviously was old enough to drive at that time, and he said, "Will I take a calf to Norwich?" And there was an old man who used to come round. He had a stick called, I forgot his name, John or something, and he used to come round. So he came with me he said he'd come with me to market in Norwich. We put this calf in the trailer, and we were going up Mill Road, and I looked in the mirror, and there was this calf jumping up the back of the trailer. So I had to stop and hide and run down and capture this calf, put it back in the trailer, and made sure it didn't get out again. That was okay, but when we got to Aylsham, there was no Aylsham bypass, and we went round the corner into the main street of Aylsham, And of course there was a big lorry, and there wasn't room for 2 vehicles to pass on that main street. So I thought, oh, well, what I'll do, I'll drive the car up onto the pavement, and then we can get past. Well, the front wheels of the car I got onto the pavement, the rear wheels, sadly, start to slew along the curb. And so I got halfway along, and the back of the car was between the front wheels of the lorry and the back wheels, and there we were stuck, and I had a trailer on the back. So I didn't know what to do then. But fortunately, a group of men came along, and we unhooked the trailer, we bounced the back of the car onto the pavement, and then that was fine, we got away. And got to Norwich and sold the car and got a decent price for it eventually. Yeah, we had a goat. Well, I'll tell you about a goat, because my father, he got a goat, and this was during the wartime, and he had brought this goat, must have had a goat on the engine, I think, because he came down Mill Road, and there was an army blockade just down the bottom of Mill Road, just before Overstrand Road, and it was dark, no street lights, of course, in those days, and as he came down there was this guard said, "Halt, who goes there?" And he said, "A man with a goat." He said, "Advanced man with a goat will be recognised." Well, of course, the goat sat down and the goat would not move. And so he was trying to tug this goat. "Advanced man with a..." Now, can you imagine a German infiltrator coming down and saying, "I'm a man with a goat"? Anyway, eventually he persuaded this guard to let him through, so we had a goat. He then got rid of the goat and got some cows. And then cows, they were on the... Well, we used the present cricket ground, we used to put cows on there, and also before it was built on Cromer Road, and the cows did occasionally get out, and they got out into the vicarage garden, the vicarage lawn, and made a bit of a mess of it. And my father never did like vicars' wives very much, because I think when he was a boy, gave the vicar in South Creek a bit of lip, and she clipped him round the ear, so he never was too keen on. And the cows, they got into the vicarage garden, and Mrs. Searle Barnes, anyone remember Mrs. Searle Barnes? Lovely lady, yeah, but she was never short of a word or two, was she? And so she didn't like very much the idea of having her cows in her garden. But anyway, we had cows there, and pigs and chickens, and he'd go to market, and Aylsham Market, and he did actually buy lots of, about a couple of dozen chickens in Aylsham Market, and then having bought them, he didn't know what to do with them, so he just shoved them in the car. So as he drove along in the car, chickens in the back seat and on his shoulders everywhere. But anyway, there were a few other things which went on then as an engine driver. They worked really hard, my parents, and it was hard work, and of course especially for those years during the war, they had no income coming in, so it wasn't until the holiday industry started to pick up a bit later on, and things got a bit better, I suppose. But after the war time, interesting, one of the things was, have I seen any changes in Cromer? Well, one big change was, it wasn't one, it was a number of changes really, was the fact that hotels in Cromer, do you know, there are nowhere near as many hotels in Cromer now as there were prior to that. There was New Haven Court, and Tony used to live in New Haven Close, did you? New Haven Court. Yeah, you lived in New Haven Court. Well, of course, New Haven Court was a lovely hotel, and there had, I think, some quite famous people stay there. But somehow that burnt down in about 1960, I don't know, 50s. And sadly, a few years later, there's some indoor tennis courts there, which also got burnt down. The indoor tennis courts were a tremendous boon. I don't know, anyone here ever played in indoor tennis courts? No? But they were, in fact, they even had a balcony all the way around. You could see a few hundred people, and I remember going up there. They even had boxing matches up there, and you could sit around and watch them. But that got burnt down as well. And then I think there was the other hotel, was the Grand Hotel, which was on the seafront. That got burnt down. It was a beautiful place, but that got burnt down. I don't know why. And of course, one morning I woke up, I had a bedroom which faced towards Overstrand. I saw this glow in the sky, and I thought, what's that? There was a Lynx Hotel, which is a huge hotel, and that was burnt down as well. It was rumoured that the Lynx Hotel, if Hitler had invaded this country, and because it was the nearest part to Germany, that would have been his headquarters, because it really was a magnificent building, and that got burnt down. I think there were one or two others, one at Ulverstrand, one at Sheringham as well. So there was a whole spate of fires where these big places were burnt down, and also not only the Links Hotel, but just down below it, there was a Links Pavilion, which was a dance hall, and that got burnt down. So the whole spate of fires, which has changed quite a bit of Cromer. My father, we used to have a man come to stay with us, a man called John Townsend from Leicester. He was a nice old boy. But he was a bit of a butt for jokes, actually, and my mother used to sometimes, she'd make at Christmas time, she'd make a lot of sausage rolls, and she'd always make 1 or 2 sausage rolls with cork inside instead of meat. And then she'd put them in such a way that John Townsend would always pick up the one with cork in. And he seemed to fall for this every time, biting it, and he was so polite he didn't know whether to spit it out or swallow it. But he went out with my father and a man, a fisherman called Dola, I don't know what his other name was, and they went out fishing, and they caught quite a lot of dabs off Cromer, and they came in, and Dola would say, right, here they are, we'll deal with Dola right now. 1 for my wife, 1 for my friend in hospital, 1 for the boat, 1 for me, 1 for you, 1 for you. 1 for my friend in hospital, 1 for the boat, 1 for the wife, 1 for me, 1 for you. And of course he got 4 for everyone else's 1. That in Dola. Well, John Townsend, he went out and he said, well, can I come out with you again? And my father didn't go out that day. And it was that particular day there was a bit of a swell. And poor old John, he got absolutely terribly seasick. And Dola said, I thought you were used to the sea. And he said, well, I was. And he said, the only ship he'd ever been on was a great big 20,000-ton troop carrier. And so he'd never actually experienced a little boat like that. But poor John Townsend, he was a nice old boy, though. Just mention to you that my father was full of stories. And he used to go up in the lounge and relate all these to people who came on holiday. One of his favourite stories is about a lady who used to go to a cafe, and she went to a cafe one day, and she had asked for a cup of coffee, and they brought her a cup of coffee with 2 sugar lumps, and she never liked to waste anything. So she thought, what should I do with these sugar lumps? And she was quite well endowed lady, so she picked them up and put them down the front, these 2 sugar lumps. Anyway, she went home in the afternoon, the vicar, he's gone away for the week, so I can tell you this story now, and Ben's not yet vicar. But the vicar came round for tea, so she said, Vicar, would you like a cup of tea? She said, yes please. So she got her best Sunday tea set out, she poured him out the tea. She said, sugar? Yes please. So she, milk? No thank you. So, excuse that joke. But he used to take me around, I haven't said much about my mother, but my father used to say he was quite keen on football. He used to take me up to Carrow Road to watch the Norwich play. And on one particular occasion, again, it must have been 1949 time, we went, Norwich were a really good team in those days. They were the bottom of the 3rd Division South. You can't get much lower than that. And they played against in the 3rd Division South against a team called Notts County. Now, Notts County did something which you never dream of. They purchased from Chelsea Tommy Lawton, who was the equivalent then of Kane, Harry Kane, of the 40s, and he was a top centre forward in the country, England's centre forward. And Notts County somehow persuaded him to go and play for them. And that night, or I think it was in the evening, they had a crowd of over 38,000, a record gate at Carrow Road. And Carrow Road wasn't developed as much as it is now. And this huge crowd there went to see Tommy Lawton. And I was with my father, and I made a mistake, because at half-time I went out to do a wee. And when I came back up the steps, I just could not get back to where I'd been with my father. So I thought, what am I going to do? So I went along the back of the Barclays stand at the top, and where there's a hotel, I think, at the corner now, there were a couple of, I think, poplar trees there. And with about another half a dozen other boys, we climbed up these poplar trees and sat on the branches and overlooked Carrow Road. Had a grandstand view from up there. And Tommy Norton did actually score the only goal of the game, I think, and Notts County won 1-0. But he took me one or two other games. He took me up to Highbury in about the same year or so, to watch Arsenal play Aston Villa. Now Arsenal were the top team in the country. They were the best team, and I can remember he took me up there. Tremendous crowd at Highbury. I'd never been there, and we got into the ground. I couldn't see a thing. And so what they did, everyone picked me up and handed me over the heads of everyone, over the fence, and into sort of a gully thing around the pitch, where all the young boys used to go. And so I had a real close view of this match. And I can remember the players. There was George Swindon, who became a Norwich manager, and then Archie McCoy, who also became a Norwich manager, and then there was Leslie Compton was a centre half. Leslie Compton and his brother Dennis Compton was playing on the wing, and Ronnie Rook, and anyway. So I can remember all these players there playing at Highbury, and Arsenal were of course the top team in the country. And he also took me up to Stamford Bridge a year or two later, and that was quite an experience because Chelsea were playing Blackpool, and that was the first time I'd ever seen Stanley Matthews play. And I just could not understand why the Chelsea defenders couldn't get the ball from him. He'd get the ball, apparently Stanley Matthews, he'd say, don't kick the ball now, I'm not going to run after it, I want it with my feet. And he'd get the ball at his feet, and they just could not get the ball from him. And I thought, why can't they? And he's amazing. They call him the wizard of the dribble. Amazing footballer. And I saw him play 4 or 5 times after that. Absolutely incredible. Stanley Matthews. But I went up to see him at Stamford Bridge first of all.
So the final question, John, is looking back over 80 plus years in Cromer and elsewhere, what do you think you've learned about life that you'd like to share with us?
Some might say you haven't learned much about life. I don't know, that's what you do. You do accumulate various things as you go on, don't you? But the adverts on the little card for this talk were twice born and now. And you might say, what on earth does that mean? So perhaps I should just explain that, should I? Twice born and now. But to do that, I'd have to take you back to 1959, and here I was, I got a degree, I got a job, it was interesting, I liked sport, and so everything was going fine and rosy. I just got my first car, and there I was in London, and I wasn't a person who went to church. I never went, I think other than 2 or 3 weddings I'd never been, and I happened to go to a downtown chapel in London, and I heard this man talking there. He was a Welshman. He had actually been a Harley Street specialist in his younger days. And this man, he was speaking. I've never seen anyone talk with so much fervour and enthusiasm and in such a way. I sat there listening to what he had to say. And he said, he read a bit from Peter's letter, gird up the loins of your mind, be sober and hope to the end for the grace which is to come upon you. And I can't repeat it because he had his Welsh voice. Gird up the loins, he had a very deep voice. Gird up the loins of your mind, be sober, hope to the end for the grace which is to come upon you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. Now I'm going to explain what gird up the loins of your mind means. The Romans, of course, it was written in Roman times, and the Romans used to have these long togas, and what they'd have to do they were very inconvenient, but if they wanted to go out to battle or get ready, they had to gird them up round their waist, round their loins. That's the loins now over to the waist, and they'd put a belt round to hold them in place. Gird up the loins, and this verse is gird up the loins of your mind, which means be prepared, get your minds ready, be prepared for action. Gird up the loins of your mind, be prepared, and be ready. And you know, we should be doing that, a group of men here. We should be girding up the loins of our minds, because it's so important that we should. It's not easy nowadays, because we're so conditioned by everything round about. We're conditioned by what we grew up with, by our parents. Reminds me of a little verse from South Pacific. It's a lovely musical. Where it's one of them says, you've got to be taught before it's too late, before you're 6 or 7 or 8, to hate all the things that your relatives hate. You've got to be carefully taught. Well, we're conditioned by our parents, by all the things around us, for good or bad. We are conditioned, so somehow we may have to put that to one side, to gird up the loins of our mind and put aside the things which we may have been taught by our school teachers, some good, some bad, by nowadays, particularly by advertising. It's incredible. There's that holy grail of free will, which is very questionable whether we have got free will. I very much doubt that we have, because we're so conditioned by everything round about, like I said, by our parents, by everything else. We're conditioned by advertising. The people who are involved in advertising, they know that full well. If they don't advertise, they don't make money. And I'm happily watching ITV, and that's a few days ago, and they was talking about Heinz tomato ketchup. I noticed that they didn't have Heinz tomato ketchup. But if I was going to a shop, I would look for Heinz tomato ketchup, because I've been conditioned almost to look for it. Our minds are conditioned by what we see and what we hear, by advertising and by everything. And interesting also that there's an article in a paper about a week or two ago, in one of the more respectable papers, about Stephen Hawking. Now you may not know that Stephen Hawking wrote that book, A Brief History of Time. It sold 10 million copies, would you believe? I sometimes wonder how many got read. But he was greatly admired and respected, Stephen Hawking. But apparently later in life he said, I've written it all from the wrong perspective. After he'd written this book, he said, I've done it all from the wrong perspective. And he shared this with a man called Thomas Hertog, who he had mentored for many, many years. And he said he struggled to know how the universe could have created conditions so perfectly hospitable to life. This great man, Stephen Hawking, later on in life, he struggled to see how the universe could have created conditions so perfectly hospitable to life. But we are guided so much by people like him, and because Stephen Hawking never claimed to be a Christian, he wasn't, I don't think, but yet we are guided by him, and 10 million people bought his books, and yet afterwards he realised, he said, I've got it all wrong, afterwards, and he shared this with Thomas Hertog. I've lived long enough to see the effects of 2 world wars. There's a book written a year or two ago called The Madness of Crowds. Now, I'm not suggesting you should read it. You can if you want to. It's quite eye-opening, really. It's written by a person who was a homosexual, but that's the material, really. But he's written this book, The Madness of Crowds, how we're affected by the crowds around us. And he gives a real eye-opener. He's about so many of our universities where you should be open to free speech. If you get someone there who actually does say what they think, the crowds will shout that person down. There isn't that free speech, the madness of crowds. And it's the world wars. I was in Germany in 1961 time, I think. I stayed up in Brunswick with somebody up there, and this mother, this lady, I think her husband had been killed, and she said, Hitler promised us everything in the 1930s, but look what's happened. This was Germany in 1961. Look what happened. He'd promised us everything. And Hitler did. He promised people everything. And they went along with him. The madness of crowds. And Hitler did that. And it's not only him, but it's happened so often. It's amazing. Japan, Japanese they were convinced, everyone, that by attacking Pearl Harbor they could conquer the Americans. Well, ridiculous. There was never any possibility of that. And yet they stirred up the people to believe that, the madness of crowds, how easy it is. Do you know, I talked about Carrow Road and going up there. I don't know how old I was, probably a teenager. I went to Carrow Road one day to watch a match, and this was before the bit was filled in on the corner between the main stand and the Berkeley end, and there was one turnstile there. There was a huge crowd outside, and that turnstile could not cope with everyone. I don't know how many thousands of people out there. And do you know what? There were two very large gates there, which they used to open at the end of the match to let people in. And the crowd pushed and pushed against those gates, and those gates collapsed. And we all streamed in. I don't know, thousands of us streamed in. We didn't have to pay. We just streamed in because the crowd, the madness of crowds, fortunately, I don't think anyone was hurt. It wasn't the same in 1989, of course, at Hillsborough. You all know about the Hillsborough disaster when the crowd streamed in. They blamed the police for opening the gates. They streamed in. What was it? 89 people were killed, was it? Something like that. Innocent people were killed because this crowd were streaming in, the madness of crowds. And how easy it is for us to be conditioned by that. And what this verse in Peter says, gird up the loins of your mind. We've got to put aside all the things which might be influencing us, and it's so easy for us not to do it, and we just carry on in the way that we have. Last week, the two greatest events in the whole of world history took place, last Friday and Sunday. The crucifixion on Friday and the resurrection on Sunday. The two biggest events in the whole of world history took place, and we remember them on those 2 days. But in this country, how many people did actually did this mean anything to people? Probably 90% of the people in this country were not bothered or not interested. And yet the two biggest events in the whole of history took place, and the vast majority of people just completely ignorant or ignored it. That's incredible, isn't it? Gird up the loins of your mind. These two things, these were not myths. That crucifixion and that resurrection were not strange myths. They were not fairy stories. They were recorded events of history. They took place. The biggest events, that crucifixion, which we remember on that Good Friday, largely ignored. That crucifixion. What an incredible event it was. When Jesus died on that cross. And you know, I guess I'm the same as all of you. I guess I don't suppose there's much difference between us all. Excuse me, I've got rather a dry mouth. We all have our problems, our hang-ups, the things we've done, which we wish we hadn't done, and the things which we should have done. We've all got these. We've all got those feelings of guilt which we hang over us all the time. They're there, and unless you're different to me, we've all got those. And that gone right from the time of when we were boys right through to manhood. And we say, oh, why did I do that? What an idiot I was. And we just wish we could wipe the slate clean. But we can't. Those things are there within us. We can't get rid of them. They're there. And we just, oh, why did I do that? Why? And they're there all the time. And that was the whole thing about the greatness of that crucifixion. Because when Jesus died on that cross, it's because, believe it or not, it was a psalm written 400 years beforehand, but he actually echoed those words. As he stood on that cross, he said, my God, why have you forsaken me? My God, why have you forsaken me? He was forsaken by God on that cross. The one person who shouldn't have been, the one person who was sinless, he was forsaken. My God, why have you forsaken me? And that's what he was on that cross. But why? He was forsaken because all the things I've done wrong, all the things you've all done wrong, were laid on him, were put on our Lord Jesus Christ on that cross. And there he was, suffering and dying in our place. I'm going to do a book here, you know. It's so easy. The things I've done wrong, they can weigh you down. It's like the feelings of guilt, of sadness, of frailties, and they can weigh us down. And there they are, on that cross at Calvary. God took all that away and put it on Jesus. There he was, carrying all that load of sin and guilt. He was carrying it on himself. Isn't that incredible? Where does that leave me? They've been taken away, taken from there to there, transferred. That's what it means. What it means, when I said twice born and then, twice born and now rather, when we realise this, when we come to see all that our Lord Jesus Christ did for us, when we come to embrace that, we realise what it was, and we are experience that death to life, that new birth. Twice born. I was born in 1936, but I was born again in 1959. Born again, twice born. And you go on from there. Gird up the loins of your mind. Start off with that. Be sober. Think to the end for the grace which is to come at the revelation of Jesus Christ. That grace is coming. It's going to come to all of us, whether we like it or not. I've got to the age now and I think, well, I don't know how many more days, how many more years I'm going to be here. Not that many, because there's a limit. But whatever happens, God's grace is going to come. It's going to come upon all of us. It's going to come at some time in the future. As sure as eggs are eggs. Do you know where that saying comes from, as sure as eggs are eggs? Anyone know? I didn't know it. I thought I was... I'll quickly tell you, it's nothing to do with it. In this country, England, the north had eggs, the south had another word, Eron. And there was this disagreement between eggs and Eron. Eventually the north won, and they said, as sure as eggs are eggs. They're not Eron, they're eggs are eggs. As sure as eggs are eggs. There's got to be this time when our Lord Jesus Christ is going to come back. He's going to come back and show us his grace and his love. Are we going to be ready for it? Have we girded up the loins of our mind, put aside everything else, and realize the wonder of what he has done for us? There is going to be an end. We don't know when. You might say, well, it's 2,000 years since Christ was on this earth. Yes, it is 2,000 years. But in God's sight, 1,000 years is just like one day. Richard here was a cosmologist. He can tell you people talking millions of light years away. In 1,000 years is just like, in God's sight is like one day. It was what? The Jews were in Egypt for 400 years before they managed to get free, the Israelites. And then these people who wrote the Old Testament, so many wrote it 400, 500, 600 years before the coming of Christ. Yet they prophesied it was going to happen all those hundreds of years before. 2,000 years is nothing. And we don't know when he's going to come back, but he will do, as sure as eggs are eggs. Have we girded up the loins of our mind? Put aside everything else. Be sober and hope to the end for that incredible grace which is to come. I better stop there, Richard.
John, for that fascinating insight into times gone past in Cromer, and it just makes us realise how much things have changed, and also for sharing your personal views at the end there. So we've now got 10 minutes if people have questions to ask, and I'll come round with a microphone, so just hang fire with your questions until I get there with the microphone.
I'm the manager of the, or was the manager of the Slough Roller Skating Club in the 60s. And since I've been here, I used to organise loads of trips to other clubs. I've heard that in Garden Street there was a really good roller skating club and a really, really friendly club. And a lot of people met their future partners and they married them. But I would like to know, I've asked them, and no one seems to know how long it was going on for, or did it start in the 60s or 50s, or Budgeons was built and then the co-op now. And I just wondered what sort of club it was, but so many people said how friendly that place was. The people who lived in Norfolk most of us, but nobody seemed to know when it was built or when it wasn't built. And looking at the Christian side of things, I think that's really good that it's a friendly place. So I don't know if anyone knows that answer.
Well, I can't give you all the dates, but there was a roller skating rink. It was in Garden Street. It used to be a cinema. And because it was a cinema, it had a sloping floor. And Norman Troller, who owned the Regal Cinema, he took over that place and he turned it into a roller skating rink. And there was a metal bar all the way around, and he had a roller skating club, a team, a roller skating team, which became quite well known. It was I never played for it because I was still quite a young lad then. My one experience I used to go there. My one experience was it going down the slope. We went down quite quickly. It was quite hard coming up, and I was going down one day, and someone came up behind me and gave me a big push, and my teeth hit the front rail, and knocked a little bit of tooth out, which has been missing ever since. But a lot of people, as you say, a lot of couples met their partners there, and it went on. I don't know when it was closed, I can't remember, I'd have to think about this, but it is now where the car park is at the back of the supermarket, yeah. But I can't think when it was. But Norman Troller was the one who instigated that and ran it for many years, yeah.
Well, thanks for that information, we appreciate it.
You're in remarkable good health, John, so what do you put that down to? Is it your sporting background? I see you out jogging some mornings, so you still do some activities now?
Steve, I'm not sure about remarkable good health. I like to go down running. I used to run a couple of mornings a week on the beach, a couple of miles, but unfortunately I now have a knee which is reacting a bit, and in fact I was playing indoor cricket in the university until quite recently. But last year, about May last year, I took 3 or 4 quick singles, and that was okay. But the next week I couldn't walk, I'm afraid, and my left knee actually was playing up. So my remarkably good health was not quite so remarkable, not quite so good health as it used to be. So I don't know. It's I can't answer why. It's but. You know, it's one of these things. It's perhaps I was brought up on our cow's milk and things like that when I was younger. But I haven't got a quick answer to that, I'm afraid, Steve.
Well, thanks for your talk. Would you just tell us a bit about how you met your wife Anne and how important an influence she's been on your life and faith?
Yeah, sorry, I just should have mentioned it. I haven't mentioned Anne, which I should have done. The strange thing was, Anne came from a Birmingham girl actually, and I was at university in Birmingham, and she was living not far away near the Cadbury's chocolate factory, and then I went down to work in Exeter, and believe it or not, she went down to study at St Lloyd's College to be an occupational therapist down in Exeter, and I didn't meet her there either. And then I came back to Norfolk and lived for a year or two in Cromer, and Anne came to live in Norfolk as well, and worked at a hospital in Aylsham, and a friend of hers, Denise, worked at a hospital in Munsley, and they shared a house at the top of Norwich Road. And in those days, I was quite involved with a group called 1525. Well, you know, I mustn't go on too much about this, but 1525, which was used to meet in the youth centre in Church Street, and it was a very, you know, quite a very busy group actually, and there were probably about 40 or 50. And 1525 meant anyone from between 15 and 25. Well, I was a bit older than that at the time, but I think the curate, Graham Whitcroft, persuaded me to go and give a hand with it. And so that's when I met Anne. initially. Well, I said we first met in a fish and chip shop at Runton, and she said, no, we didn't, we met in the youth centre. So whichever it was, we met around about that time. And then we got married in 1972, and we've had an uneventful 51 years. We've got our wedding anniversary last week, actually, last Sunday? Yeah. So I said 51 uneventful years, but we did manage to somehow have 5 children who all are now grown up with, I think we have 11 grandchildren. Anyway, is that enough for you? But Anna's very busy. She, up at St Martin's on a Monday morning, she has this drop-in centre for people coming up and meals, and 1 or 2 other people help her with that on a Monday. And then on Thursday you have another one where they're large, just for anyone really, anyone can drop in, but largely lots of young families come up there on a Thursday morning, young mums with their children, and she's heavily involved with that. And but she used to run girls' pathfinder groups and all things like that. She did much more than I ever did. But anyway, thank you, Ben, for mentioning it. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, John, for that absolutely fascinating talk. Let's just show our appreciation in that.